Hi there, Heather Steves here, and today I want to share with you a layout that I created using this retired Tommy suite, and I decided to scrap lift this layout here, which is from a previous album retreat. So here's how I started. So I already had my sketch basically done before I started this layout, but I just wanted to walk you through with how I figured out the sketch based on the scrapbook layout that I saw. So of course I started with my two 12 by 12s. So I've got those there. And then the best way to start to figure out the other pieces for me is putting your photos in there. So I was under the assumption it was a 4 by 6, and based on the other sizes, it definitely was a 4 by 6. What I might have to do though is, because I am finding it a little bit squishy, at least on this side, is I might end up actually trimming them down, because you see that I've got a 4 by 6 and then it's matted. So I did my 4 by 6, I did a shape, just a square. I made it 4 by 6. I took off the lock there, I put 4, and then my height is 6. And then I did an offset. And so that's how I create my mats. And I actually do it at 0.125. That gives me 1/8 of an inch around. So 0.125. I'm not actually sure that those ones are. Make sure that you have the little square, not the rounded. You want it square edges. Done. And so then that gives you your mat. You just need to, so I'll show you how I fix that. So see, it sends my mat right to the back. So just go into my layers and I find my mat. It's not that one. It's at the bottom, of course, because it's at the back. And then I can go to edit and, oh, sorry, I've gotten them both highlighted there. Edit and arrange, and I can bring it forward. So I'm just going to bring it to front, and then I'm going to send it back one. That's the faster way to do it. Then I can select both of those squares or rectangles, and then I can attach them. There we go. So now I can move them around easily without them. Whoops. I don't know what that new feature is, driving me crazy. But then I can move them around easily. So I'm just going to delete that because I've already got them there. So that was just to quickly show you how I do my photos and mats. So that then helps me to determine the size. So initially when I drew this, I had this inside shape. It's basically 9 by 9. I had it at, it must have been 8 3/4 or 8.5 or something. I had it smaller and I wasn't liking it. So I made it a little bit bigger. So my blue mat there, which I can't seem to grab there, that is at 9.5 by 9.5. And then my inside, it should really be 9. It's off, doesn't really matter. There, now it's at 9. Sometimes things just get shifted a bit. So now it's at 9. So anyway, by having that, it helps me determine what size I need for my spacing. So then the next step was I drew this rectangle. So this rectangle I drew at 3.5 by 11. So just based on my sketch, again, I was guessing. It is pretty tight over here to the side. But I wanted to have enough space around my photo. So this does allow me at this size. The issue that I'm struggling with is I'm going to modify this right page. So I want to add a 4 by 6 where the sketch does not have that. It just has some stamping and some decorative elements up at the top, and then it has a waterfall, which the waterfall is probably bigger than this. It's probably designed for 3 by 4 photos. My photos are only 2.5 by 3.5, so they're quite a bit smaller, a little bit smaller. But then my mat is almost that size. So anyway, in order for it to all fit, I needed to make sure that this white piece was going to be big enough to give me some white space around my photos. I have, the mat is at 3 inches by 3 3/4, which is basically because I need to have a little bit of a spine there for it to flap back and forth. So I'm going to duplicate that a number of times, but I also have a 4 by 6 photo that I want to tuck underneath there. I'm hoping that I can trim it down so that it's actually at the 3 inches but I'm not sure that I can trim it down that small. So I'm gonna have to play around with that a bit. And that again is why I think I might have to trim my 4x6 down so that the mat itself is a 4x6. Then that'll give me a little bit more play, and then I might even make that mat a 3 1/4. Just so then my photo that I'm going to put on the bottom. So anyway, basically what I'm showing you is I use my photos to kind of determine the sizes of the other components. It's a pretty simple layout in terms of the shapes that are on there. So it's pretty simple to kind of determine my size for these pieces. But I am going to struggle a little bit with, as I start to add my waterfall there, making sure that it fits nicely into here. So I didn't bother playing around with it in Design Space anymore. I'm going to do that figuring out when I actually start to lay out my pieces of paper. So hopefully that just helps you kind of figure out how I've scrap lifted a layout without actually having the dimensions. So now that I know what size I need my papers at, I'm going to start to cut them down to size. And with this pattern paper here, I'm just kind of playing around with which way I want it to be facing and what pieces I'm going to cut off. So that's why you see me turning it around a couple of times there. And once I have those ones done, then I can go ahead and cut the mat, the cardstock that's going to be behind it. So you might notice when I'm doing this, I've actually cut it a little bit bigger than what it shows in the original layout. I thought about keeping it the same, but I really liked the fact that there was a little bit more of that blue showing through to anchor it. So those are basically all of the pieces that are required for this layout. So now I can go ahead and start to attach everything down. So I will just skip forward to where I have finished that. So there wasn't a lot of different colors in this paper pack, so I ended up deciding to pull in some pewter cardstock to use for matting my photos. I did end up sanding the edge of the photo before I went ahead and attached them. It just gives it a little bit more definition. And so I'm just attaching those down onto the mats, and then I needed to figure out what sizes the mats need to be for the waterfall. So I ended up deciding to make them 4 inches high, and then that way I can trim my photo, that 4x6 photo, to fit better behind it. But in order to figure out all of the sizes for all of the other mats, I decided to go back into Design Space and start to play around with that, just so that I make sure that everything is nice and even. So what I ended up doing was I cut my first mat at 4 inches high, as I mentioned, and then it's 3.5 inches wide. So 3 inches wide to provide the mat part for my photo, but then an additional 1/2 inch for the spine. So then I was trying to figure out what my next one should be, because I'm going to just butt up the edge of the paper to the edge of the spine, if that makes sense. So they're not going to overlap, they're going to butt up to each other. So that meant that I had to add extra so that it would stick out from the bottom, but that I wanted to make sure that that 1/2 inch is where it started, where the spine would be attached. So basically what I ended up working out to was an extra 1/2 inch for each of those layers. So that's what you see me doing here, is just playing around with that and making sure that it's going to fit across my white paper there and have nice even spacing. So I drew all of those pieces, I spread them out, and then I found out that 1/2 inch extra worked out perfectly. So next I just duplicated this 4x6 that's up there, but I wanted, as I mentioned, to trim it down. So I made it for the mat 4x6, and then I tucked it under there just to make sure that it looked like it was going to be evenly spaced, and it did work out perfectly that way. So next I just took some of those mats and I was just changing the colors so that I could play around with making sure that I knew what papers to cut at which size so that it would look nice. Now that I've sorted all that out, I can go ahead and cut my cardstock papers. So each one is a 1/2 inch wider than the previous one, and then each of them got scored at a 1/2 inch to allow for that spine. So when I look closer at the actual close to my heart layout, I think that they probably did that waterfall a bit differently and layered all of their pieces one on top of the other as opposed to staggering them like I'm going to do, but I'm okay with that, and I'm happy with the way that this one is going to come together anyway. So you can see I'm just laying them out, testing them to make sure that they're going to work out nicely, and I'm happy with that. So next up, I'm just going to start to attach all of my photos, so I have enough to put photos on both sides of each one of these flaps. So now that all my photos are on the flaps, I can go ahead and attach this larger photo, which was a 4x6, but now I've trimmed it down. I didn't want to trim any more off of it, so the mat around it is actually smaller than what is on the flaps, but I'm okay with it looking different. I think it looks fine and it's hardly noticeable. So because the flaps are going to be open and closed possibly many times, I wanted to make sure that they were going to be attached very well. So I've attached score tape to each one of those spines, and now I can attach my larger piece at the bottom. I've got a little bit of a gap all the way around, and then each one gets butted up to the one below. So you can see I just pulled a little bit of the score tape backing off so that I can line it up and then pull that down and make sure everything's aligned and nice and straight. So you can see me using my Cricut scraper. I was just making sure that my score tape is fully secure. So you want to make sure that you put that pressure on the adhesive so that it does make a full bond. I've trimmed down that top photo so that the mat is a full 4x6, and then I didn't leave enough of a gap there because I want some space so that I can put tabs to flip my waterfall. So I noticed on my inspiration layout that they had done some decorative stamping. There you can see it on that little flap and then also on the bottom of this title piece. So I pulled out some border stamps from my stash, and I'm going to use that, but because my waterfalls are already attached, I have to be careful. So I grabbed some scrap paper, I've put it down, I've made sure that I'm on my Versa mat so that I have enough cushion, and then I can go ahead and stamp there without any worries that I'm going to make a mess anywhere. So I'm going to do a little tone on tone stamping on this red title piece. So I've pulled out my stamp, and it's quite thin, so I want to make sure it's in a straight line. So you see I just decided that I could use my cardstock to push it down and make it nice and straight so then I can pick it up with my block. So I've never done this before. I just did it for this one and it was pretty amazing. I was very happy with how easy that was because I've really struggled with that in the past with these tiny thin border stamps. So again, I have another one and I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to lay it down and then I'm going to push it with my cardstock, and that just made it nice and straight. And then you see I've got two stamps here, so one's on each side because I only have the one long block, and I can still see what I'm doing. And so I stamped the little flag border and then the little dots as well. And then I'm just testing it out because on the bottom I'm not sure if it's going to look as nice with the dots on the bottom of the flags as it would on the top of the flags, but I think it's going to look fine. And so I did go ahead and do that, and it actually looks quite nice, and it's just a little tiny detail that just makes things look really nice. So now I can start to figure out some of my embellishments on this layout. So I've got some coordinating ones that came with the kit, and I pulled out this white ribbon that I had in my stash, and I thought it's pretty plain, but maybe I could stamp on it. So I actually ended up pulling out that banner stamp again, and I'm going to stamp on this white ribbon. I'm going to choose the outdoor denim and try and pull that color into my embellishments a bit, and it actually works really well on the ribbon. Unfortunately, when I put the ribbon down, it doesn't stand out as much as I had hoped that it would because of the light pattern paper, I guess. So I'm just going to leave that for now and move on to my title. So I've pulled out some of these acrylic letters from my stash. These are from Close to My Heart, but they are retired, but there are new ones available now. So I created this nice little saying, and then I have a piece of honey butter cardstock that I'm also going to use just like the sample layout, and I ended up dovetailing the ends of that. So now I'm going back to this ribbon again because, like I said, I'm not happy with it. I tried the honey butter, but it didn't really do much. So I thought I'm going to try a piece of white cardstock and do that instead. Maybe it'll stand out better than the ribbon. But this time I stamped it with the pewter ink, and I thought that that might look better, but in the end I wasn't happy with it still. So I ended up pulling out some cranberry ribbon from my stash. I've had it for a long time. It's a really big roll, and that's what I'm going to end up using. So my original intention was to actually stamp the word ship onto the banner, but I didn't have any stamps that I actually liked with it. So I decided to just go ahead and cut it out on my Cricut. So I cut it out with outdoor denim, and then I'm popping up the banner as well as the word ship onto some foam tape just to give some nice dimension onto that title. I just pulled out my close to my heart T-square ruler, and I'm just using that to make sure that I've centered the word ship onto that banner. So this kit came with some canvas shapes as the embellishment. So in order to determine which ones I want to use, I just cut the whole carrier sheet around the piece that I want so that I can test it and then it's not sticky on the back. So next up, I'm just going to start to attach this ribbon. So I'm going to use some score tape for that. I've got my grid ruler out just to make sure that I get things nice and straight. And even though I've already attached my papers down to my background, I can still just kind of peel that corner up so that I can tuck that little loose end in behind there. So you may have noticed that I haven't attached this cranberry title piece to my layout yet. Part of the reason for that was because I was very undecided if I was going to keep it that size or trim it down. But I did end up deciding that I would keep it that size. It does cover up a lot of that pattern paper, but in the end, I like the way that it looks with the title being that wide. So I'm finally going to stick it down. I'm committing, and I'm okay with attaching that and then my photo down to the page so that now I can actually work on my title and finalize it. So I started by adding this little banner piece at the bottom. I figured that I needed to add it first so that I could then work on the spacing of my acrylic letters. It was a little bit of a pain because now it makes it harder for me to attach the acrylic letters, as you can see, because I want to use my ruler as a guide. So ultimately it would have been easier to do it right side up, but it just wasn't going to work out that way because I wanted to make sure that I had everything lined up and spaced nicely. So I just put it on my Versamat there so I can use the grid and my grid ruler just to line everything up. And I'm just using some dries clear liquid glue to attach these acrylic letters down to my page, and I'm just butting the tops of them all up against my ruler there just to make sure that everything is nice and straight. So you may have noticed that I started by attaching the O in the word R because I wanted to make sure that I had things centered right to left. So it's always easier to try and start in the middle and work your way out, because if you start at the right side or the left side, you often end up with it not being centered nicely. So for the next word, I ended up turning it back around so it's right side up, and then I spaced out my letters so I was able to actually start with the W, knowing that I had already centered it. So it was just a little bit easier on this word than starting in the middle. So I'll just jump forward so you don't have to watch me attach every single letter here. Now that my title is all attached, I'm going to go ahead with my embellishments, and I've decided on this little canvas shape down here. But because it's so sticky, I wanted to make sure that I took the stickiness away with my anti-static pouch. Then I can add my foam tape and not worry about the edges getting stuck down to my layout once it's in the album. So this kit also came with these cute little banners. They are canvas on a little toothpick. So I'm going to actually pop that banner piece up with some foam tape as well, and then attach that to my page. And I don't need to worry about attaching the stick down anywhere else because once I put this other shape on top of it, that's going to hold the stick in place. Next up, I'm going to look for some little embellishments. The kit came with these little stars. They're canvas as well. And the enamel dots. The enamel dots are not actually the outdoor denim, which is the color of the cardstock, but they're sapphire, but it's close enough color that you really don't notice that there's a difference in it. And this is just mimicking what is shown on the sample layout. It's a tiny bit different, but similar. And then I'm also going to mimic my little banner and shape that's on the left side. I'm going to mimic that here onto the right side. So I'm doing the same method with my anti-static pouch and the foam tape, and I'm going to attach those two little pieces down as well. So my next step is then to add some tabs to my waterfall pieces. So I've taken my 1-inch punch and I've just punched out some coordinating colored cardstock, and I'm just going to add some of these canvas shapes to it. So I've got some different colored stars, and then I have these little circles that have stars in them as well. So I'm just adding those to the circles first, and then I'm going to use my liquid adhesive to glue them onto each individual waterfall piece. I think the liquid adhesive is probably a better option, since these are again going to be used to pull the tabs open. So there might be a little bit more stress. So I'm just making sure that everything's spaced out nice and evenly, and then I'm attaching them down. So in order to make sure that they're nice and straight and even, again, I've pulled out my close to my heart grid ruler here, and I've just put it at the top. So now I can make sure that the tops of every circle aligns nice and straight. Now, since my photos are smaller than the actual tabs of paper, I wanted to do some embellishing on them. So I pulled out some stamps, and I've got this one ready to go. And you see that I've put my Versamat underneath it so that I get a nice crisp stamp with that. And here I am just flipping through, showing you the different embellishments that I put on those flaps. So I couldn't leave you without showing you how to now put your interactive piece into your memory protector and cut an opening so that you can actually see your waterfall. So I have a little rub-on tool, and I'm just using that to poke and mark the corners of those flaps. And because I can't see the underside there, I'm just taking a scrap piece of paper and I'm sliding it in and sliding it under the very last flap. And then that just shows me my little edge there so that I can see where it is when I'm marking it. So I'm just marking the bottom one, and then the top one I can't mark because that circle's in the way. So I'm just going to grab a little black marker and I'm going to use that. And ultimately, if you just use a little black marker, that would probably work for all of them. So now that I have those holes all marked out, I'm going to slide in my cutting mat into my memory protector, and then I'm using the old close to my heart hole punch. You can use the old hammer style if you have it, whatever you have to mark those holes. And then I'm making sure that my mat with the grid is lined up nicely, because using my ruler with the cork backing is very important. Then I can make sure that I'm actually getting those lines nice and straight. Because sometimes the holes don't actually punch as straight as they should be. So it just helps to have that grid mat inside so that I can make sure. So I'm just connecting all of those punches, those holes that I punched, and I'm going to cut out that entire piece. So now we can go ahead and put our layout back into our memory protector, and then we just very carefully, I pull those waterfall flaps through that opening, and as they get bigger, it gets a little bit harder, but just take your time and be gentle so as not to fold the paper, but just bend it. And then we are all done, and we can use our waterfall within our album. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and have a wonderful day.